I'm Tom Haig, and I'm a journalist who specializes on disability communities in poor countries. But before I even went to journalism school,
Go Cougs!
I spent 3 years as a corporate journalist for Adidas America. After working at several jobs with Adidas, I was hired as the fourth member of Adidas, the Adidas America corporate newspaper. But Adidas had a heritage that went back to the early days of the Portland supergiant Nike.
Nike, like so many corporations, was fussing around. They had the Nike Barb, for instance, and that mostly had people's birthdays in it, and that was the internal document that circulated for personnel. It was, when I had the opportunity to think of corporate communications and doing something different, I thought maybe we could have a newspaper. That would be fun. Because actually, I don't know that anybody else had a newspaper quite like the one we envisioned. With a company growing so fast as they were, there was a great need to keep people informed. And this is before, later I was a large proponent of the intranet or whatever to share digitally what information was going on, but this is prior to that. So there's a lot going on that's difficult to disperse to everybody. Plus Nike, and they weren't all near Beaverton. They were on the East Coast, and they were beginning to be around the world. So a newspaper would work. It was a little difficult in those days because we had to mail copies, which, of course, in the digital age obviated the need for. But the idea was we'd give that paper as much independence as we could as a corporate rag, realizing that the corporation was paying for it, and no one was going for the Pulitzer. But we wanted to be pretty upfront, candid, as well as humorous, but also share information.
But there was just too much talent in the room for one shoe company, so a handful of the Nike founders split off, eventually landing a gig running the long-neglected U.S. subsidiary of the German shoe giant, Adidas.
You get a little fed up with the changes, and I was still I was early 40s, I guess. One morning before work, I grabbed a basketball in the driveway and was saying, after warming up, if this shot goes in, I'm quitting or whatever. And I threw up a hook from the corner, and there's nothing but net.
And that brings us to the subject of this piece, Adidas. Adidas started at Club 21, a small dive bar in Portland, Oregon, just across the street from the newly formed Adidas America.
One of the people that was really responsible for certainly the mechanics of the Nike Times was a guy named Jim Price, who was a local journalist, worked for the Hillsborough Argus. He'd run newspapers when he was in the Army, where he was affectionately known as the Fat Sergeant. And so I asked him if he would come back and take a second bite at the apple and do la-di-da, and he agreed.
And this is where yours truly enters the story.
I met Tom Haig at Club 21. I think he was flogging copy machines at the time, but he was a friend of Rachel's, and any friend of Rachel, of course, was a friend of mine.
I'm sitting at the scene of the crime, basically. This is Club 21, and this is where, back in the 90s, most Adidas employees would come after work for a watering hole. A lot of business got done here, and if you did not work at Adidas, which I did not when I first moved to Portland, this is where you came to get a job. And it was at this table right behind me where I sat with Jay Edwards and Jim Price and was basically asking them to hire me at Adidas. And they came up with the idea that they were going to do a newspaper, and they needed a name for the newspaper. And I went and I quickly thought, if I can come up with the name of the newspaper, they have to hire me. So I put my thinking cap on. I had to leave the table, and I walked into this very restroom and sat on this very toilet and went through the alphabet, which is it's a technique that songwriters do when they're coming up with rhymes. You go Adidas, Badidas, Cadidas, Dadidas, Fidas, everything, and all of a sudden I went Medidas, and I got to L, and it was Ladidas, and then I hit me, and I was like, whoa, 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 whoa. In Europe, they call Adidas Adidas, and if you do an L apostrophe, that's going to be Ladidas. And I immediately rushed back to the table, and I said, hey, I got an idea. How about Ladidas? And Jay looked at me, and Jay said, you know, there's some serendipity to that. I think we can use that. Ladidas was born, but production was difficult.
I would go up, drive up the gorge on a Wednesday night, because I think we used to like try and get it to the printer on Thursday morning. I would go up every Wednesday night with a couple of bottles of wine, and we'd look and see how much copy we were missing and what photos we were missing, to see how we'd have to enlarge something to be quite inappropriately oversized. And we'd put the paper to bed sometime late Wednesday evening, and I would drive back down 84 and anxious to see what sort of egregious errors we had memorialized.
Nonetheless, the young, ambitious target audience ate it up.
There were no old people there. It was jam-packed with 20-year-olds and 30-year-olds, I guess. Being in my 40s, I was like a grandfather at the time. The enthusiasm ran high. You know, you don't have to pay them very much. They like being there. And generally, the old adage was you just roll a keg out and maybe print some free T-shirts, and that would keep them going for another several months. But I think they embraced la-di-da. Because it was different than what Blue Cross Blue Shield was putting out, or any other corporate document they'd seen before.
As the company exploded, it was time to hire a full-time La-di-da's correspondent. The search was over almost as soon as it had started.
Jim was still working like half-time because he owned a newspaper, the Skamania County Pioneer. And we needed somebody to come in and be there full-time. And gosh, I don't know if we interviewed anybody else other than Scott. He seemed like a regular Joe.
I was at Oregon State University, graduated in '93, and was such a sports fan that I was trying to find classes that I could actually pass, and figured out that these journalism classes, especially involving sports reporting, were something that appealed to me. So I saw a job posted in the Oregonian, and looked at it and just shook my head like, man, that would be perfect. To have that job, that would be a dream. At that time, Jay was really into smoking a lot of cigars, and he and Jim would, you know, the parking garage was 20 feet away or whatever. I think they had most of their actual meetings in the parking garage, and that's where I was interviewed. It was $24,000 a year, and so this would have been in about '96. So, and at that point, that would have been a huge raise for me. Huge raise. That was effectively doubling my salary from where I was coming from. So they were embarrassed to tell me what the pay was going to be, and really had no idea how excited I was to actually be getting that much money. And they finally said, well, we've kind of made a decision. Are you actually willing to take this job for $24,000 a year? And I said, absolutely. And he said, well, then I think you're going to get the job.
We wanted somebody who was good with a camera and could write, and we'd fill in the humor if need be. if he was lacking in that department. But Scott held his own, he was fine. But he became our Jimmy Olsen cub reporter, and that's what I've really called him ever since.
With a fully funded staff, Adidas began to take form with some regular features.
We took liberties in some of our featured syndicated columns, I guess, and I haven't reviewed these, but I think the well-known ones were Heil Herald, where Harold Strasser, Rob's father, wearing an eye patch, would pontificate about anything, and loudly and obscenely, generally. We had It's the Law by Robert Erb, where he was blindfolded.
But the reason everyone picked up a copy of Adidas was to see who would be lampooned in the monthly Doer's Profile.
We ran a piece called the Doer's Profile in each edition, and it was based on Doer's Scotch. Had a national campaign for several years that was pretty famous. Essentially, who drinks Doer's Scotch, and it was last book read, and do's and don'ts or preferences, this and that. It was a person's profile, and we changed the Doers from D-E-W-E-R-S to D-O-E-R-S. Brilliant.
The way I like to do them is we would take, if we were going to do maybe a sales rep, I would wait until we were at like a sales kickoff, and we could bring all of their coworkers, into a small room and knock out a Doer's Profile. And then it wasn't necessarily coming from me or the paper or whatever. It was, these jabs were coming from their best friends or, their closest coworkers, which, were much more apropos to the person and pretty funny stuff.
If you didn't have tough skin, the Young Adidas was not the place for you. Nobody, not even senior management, presidents, nor CEOs, were spared. And as the company grew, so did the internal communications department.
When we had a little more space and moved over to Nimbus, we could branch out a little bit, and because we could see that there was more than just the entertainment and dissemination of information through la-di-da that was probably necessary to run a viable organization of the size it was becoming.
After a couple years at Adidas, I had been relegated to the t-shirt sourcing department, and I was dismissed after a debacle surrounding the 1996 Nebraska National Championship tee. And shortly after being dismissed, I broke my back, and I went through rehab. I was out of commission for 5-6 months. I traveled around the world, and I came back, and Jay called me in to the office, which had moved over to Nimbus, and he asked me if I wanted to work for the paper, and I was like, yes. And in short time, I hopped into the department, and Scotty moved over, started doing digital stuff like Scoop and working, putting stuff up on DOSNet. And then for the last 2 years, the paper was my baby. Did everything. The stage was set for a terrific run. Although we were best known for keeping corporate culture vibrant, 90% of Adidas was pertinent corporate information. But in the end, Adidas' finest hours were when we attempted to do daily pages at the Adidas sales meetings.
So Jay had decided that he wanted to try and do a daily newspaper and wondered if we were up for it. And of course we said sure. We would typically have, you know, a featured speaker or some kind of an event every night. And so that really lent itself to kind of that front page, cover page photo and story that went with it. And then there was just so much going on at those sales meetings, whether it was a game of soccer that wasn't supposed to necessarily be that competitive, but of course, because it was an Adidas sales meeting, got incredibly competitive. We would bring all of our computers and these massively huge printers. Do you remember how big some of that stuff was? And you know, half the room would be full of all of our junk. And but I mean, it was a legitimate operation that we had. We were cranking them out. Sometimes it went till 2 in the morning or whatever, but I think the thing that was hardest is that we were always kind of towing the edge about, you know, how far can we go with this? And at 2 in the morning, your judgment isn't always that good.
In 2001, amongst rumors that the powers in Herzo did not like having such a powerful communication piece coming from a subsidiary, Adidas was shut down. But it was never forgotten. As it turns out, it wasn't the corporation that generated the content, but the people who worked there. And as 4 Adidas America legends left the fold, Adidas returned to salute them.